The morning chill crept through the cracks of the worn-out apartment window, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant city life. Lena, a bright-eyed 6-year-old, pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her small frame before slipping quietly out of bed. The tiny one-bedroom apartment in a rundown section of town was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of traffic below. She knew what that meant. Her mother, Hannah, was having another bad day. Lena tiptoed to the adjoining room, where her mother lay in bed, her breathing shallow, her once vibrant face now gaunt and pale. The morning light filtered through faded curtains, casting soft golden hues over the room's sparse furnishings: a second-hand nightstand, a wooden chair missing a leg, and a small framed picture of a woman holding a baby, smiling despite the exhaustion in her eyes. It was the only photo Lena had ever seen of her mother before she got sick. "Mom?" Lena whispered, climbing onto the bed and snuggling close, searching for even the faintest warmth. Hannah stirred and forced a smile, her fingers brushing through Lena's curly hair. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you hurting today?" Lena asked, her big brown eyes filled with concern. "A little," Hannah admitted, though they both knew it was more than just a little. The medication was running low, and without it, the pain became unbearable. Lena knew the routine well: warm water, pink and white pills, a small breakfast of toast, and whatever else they could afford that week. Their food stamps had stretched as far as they could, but the fridge was nearly empty. The only thing that never changed was the small wooden music box sitting on the shelf above the couch. Lena had always loved it, the delicate carvings on its sides, the tiny ballerina that spun when the lid was opened, the soft, familiar tune it played. It had belonged to her mother for as long as Lena could remember. One day, when she had asked about it, Hannah had said, "It was given to me by someone I loved very much before you were born. He never knew about you, but this is all I have left of him." She never said more than that. But that morning, as Hannah drifted back to sleep after taking her medication, Lena made a decision. She climbed onto the couch, reached for the music box, and held it tightly in her small hands. If she could sell it, she might be able to buy her mother's medicine, at least for another few weeks. She wrapped it carefully in the only nice scarf they owned, tucked it into her backpack, and pulled on her too-big coat, the same one her mother had bought second-hand last winter. The city was a big, unfamiliar place for a little girl alone, but Lena had long learned not to be afraid. She straightened her tiny shoulders, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and began walking. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she had to find someone willing to buy the music box. And fast. Lena walked 6 blocks, her small legs carrying her past bustling storefronts and hurried pedestrians. The wind picked up, rustling the fallen leaves along the cracked sidewalk, and she pulled her oversized coat tighter around her tiny frame. She had been to this part of town before, holding her mother's hand as they window shopped back when Hannah had been well enough to walk with her. She remembered the stores filled with warm light, the smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor, and the way her mother's eyes had lingered on the antique shop's display case, where delicate trinkets sat behind polished glass. That was where Lena was headed. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside Weston's Antiques and Curiosities, the scent of old books and polished wood filling the air. Behind the counter stood an older man with silver hair and a tweed vest. He adjusted his glasses as he glanced up, surprised to see a child alone in his shop. "Can I help you, young lady?" he asked, his voice kind but cautious. Lena swallowed hard and reached into her backpack. With careful hands, she unwrapped the scarf and placed the music box on the counter. The warm glow from the overhead lamps made the golden details shimmer. "I want to sell this," she said firmly, though her voice wavered just a little. The man leaned in, inspecting the piece. "It's a lovely item," he admitted. "But I don't buy things from children." "Where are your parents?" Lena lifted her chin, summoning the dignity only a child forced to grow up too fast could have. "My mom is sick," she explained. "We need money for her medicine." The shopkeeper hesitated, his wrinkled hands resting on the counter. Before he could speak, the bell over the door chimed again. Ethan Walker rarely entered antique shops. At 35, with a vast fortune built in the tech industry, he had people to buy things for him. But something had caught his eye as he passed the store, perhaps boredom on yet another day filled with meaningless meetings, or maybe fate pulling him toward the shop at just the right moment. "Mr. Walker," the shopkeeper exclaimed, nearly knocking over his glasses in surprise. "What an honor to have you here." Ethan barely acknowledged the greeting, his gaze instead drawn to the music box on the counter and the small girl standing beside it. There was something about the way she held herself, a mix of determination and quiet desperation that struck a chord in him. "Is that for sale?" Ethan asked, pointing to the music box. Lena looked up at him. He was tall, dressed in an expensive suit, but his eyes weren't like the other rich men she had seen. There was something lonely about them, though she couldn't quite explain why. "Yes," she said simply. "It's special." Ethan knelt down to her height, sensing the gravity of her words. "May I see it?" After a brief hesitation, Lena nodded and handed over the box. Ethan opened the lid, and a soft melody filled the shop as the tiny ballerina began to spin. A strange feeling washed over him, a tug at something deep within, something distant yet familiar. "How much do you want for it?" he asked, still staring at the box. $300, Lena said without hesitation. It was the exact amount her mother needed for the next month's medication. The shopkeeper coughed. "The girl doesn't know what she's talking about, Mr. Walker. Let me assess it properly for you." "500, Ethan interrupted, his gaze locked onto Lena's. "It's worth 500. Lena's eyes widened. It was more money than she had ever seen. "But there's a condition," Ethan continued. "You have to tell me the story behind it." Lena hesitated, then answered, "It was my mom's. A man she loved very much gave it to her before I was born. It's the only thing we have left of him. Mom says he doesn't know I exist." Ethan felt his chest tighten, an inexplicable sense of connection forming. "What's your mother's name?" "Hannah," Lena said. "Hannah Evans." The name meant nothing to him, yet somehow, it sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan reached into his wallet, counted out 5 crisp $100 bills, and handed them to Lena. "Thank you," she said, holding the money carefully. Then, with one last lingering glance at the music box, she added, "Please take good care of it." "I will," Ethan promised. As Lena turned to leave, Ethan called after her, "What's your name?" She paused. "Lena Evans." "And where do you live, Lena?" Lena hesitated. Her mother had always warned her not to give out personal information, but something about this man felt safe. "The Westbrook Building. Apartment 512. Ethan nodded, memorizing the address without knowing why. As the door closed behind Lena, he stood there, staring at the music box in his hands. He had just bought far more than an antique. He had bought a secret that would change his life forever. Ethan Walker sat in the back of his sleek black town car, the music box resting on his lap. He turned it over in his hands, running his fingers along the intricate carvings. Something about it felt strangely familiar, but he couldn't place why. The melody had stirred something deep inside him, a whisper of a memory just out of reach. "Home, sir?" his driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Ethan hesitated. "Yes," he finally said, his voice distant. The car pulled smoothly through the city streets toward his penthouse in the Upper East Side. Normally, he barely noticed his surroundings, too consumed by business deals, stock market trends, and board meetings. But tonight felt different. The weight of the music box in his hands was heavier than it should have been. As soon as he arrived home, Ethan set the box on his desk and loosened his tie. The penthouse was massive, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking view of the city, expensive art pieces lining the walls. Yet, it felt empty. He opened the lid of the music box again. The soft tune played, delicate yet haunting. He watched the tiny ballerina spin, mesmerized. Then, something caught his eye. A small irregularity at the base. He ran his fingers along the bottom of the box, pressing gently. To his surprise, a tiny panel shifted. With careful precision, he pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment inside. Tucked neatly within was an old, slightly faded photograph. Ethan's breath caught as he pulled it out. It was a picture of a young couple, standing by a serene lake, smiling at the camera. The woman had long, wavy hair and a radiant smile. The man. Ethan's heart stopped. The man in the photo was his father. Jonathan Walker, 30 years younger but unmistakable, the same sharp jawline, the same confident stance, the same familiar warmth in his eyes that Ethan had only ever seen in old family pictures. Ethan gripped the edge of his desk, his mind racing. His father had never mentioned this woman. Never once had he spoken about another love before Ethan's mother. Who was she? And then another realization hit him. Lena's words echoed in his head. A man my mom loved very much gave it to her before I was born. He doesn't know I exist. His stomach twisted. He glanced back at the photo, his hands trembling. Was it possible? Had his father fathered a child he never knew about? Ethan's pulse pounded as he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one person who might have the answers. His father. Jonathan Walker, now 65, was a powerful man, respected, feared in the business world, yet never cruel. Ethan had always admired him, but their relationship had been distant. His father had spent years building his empire, leaving little time for family. Ethan hesitated only a moment before pressing call. The phone rang twice before Jonathan picked up. "Ethan," his father greeted, his voice steady. "It's late. Is something wrong?" Ethan took a deep breath, gripping the photograph tighter. "Dad, I need to ask you something." A pause. "Go ahead. Did you ever love someone before Mom? Someone named Catherine Evans?" Silence. A long, unbearable silence. Ethan could hear his father's breathing shift, the slight hitch that told him he had struck a nerve. "Where did you hear that name?" Jonathan's voice was quieter now, wary. Ethan swallowed. "I bought an antique music box today. A little girl was selling it to pay for her mother's medicine." He exhaled. "Inside, I found a photo of you with a woman by a lake." More silence. Then, a slow, trembling breath from his father. "I thought I'd never see that picture again," Jonathan finally whispered, almost to himself. Ethan's chest tightened. "Who is she, Dad?" Jonathan's voice was thick with something Ethan had never heard before, regret. "She was the love of my life," he admitted. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then why did you leave her?" Jonathan sighed. "Because I was a coward." Ethan stayed silent, letting his father gather his thoughts. "We were young," Jonathan continued. "Too young, according to my father. He didn't approve, said she wasn't on our level. That being with her would ruin my future. He threatened to cut me off, to ruin her life, to make sure she'd never find peace. His voice wavered. I was too weak to fight back. So, I walked away, thinking I was protecting her. Ethan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Did you know she was pregnant? The stunned silence that followed confirmed the truth. No, Jonathan whispered. His voice cracked. She was pregnant? Ethan closed his eyes, his mind spinning. She had a daughter, Dad. Her name is Hannah. And she has a little girl named Lena. A harsh inhale on the other end of the line. I have a daughter. Ethan's throat felt tight. And a granddaughter. A sharp exhale. He could picture his father sinking into his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to make sense of what he had just learned. All these years, Jonathan Walker had lived his life believing he had one son. But now, in the span of a single evening, everything had changed. Where is she now? Jonathan asked, his voice urgent. Hannah? Ethan's heart ached. She's sick, Dad. Really sick. Lena sold the music box to buy her medicine. The weight of those words hung between them. Jonathan's voice, when he finally spoke again, was filled with determination. Then we need to find them, he said firmly. Before it's too late. The Westbrook building was old, its blue paint peeling at the edges, a far cry from the pristine luxury that Ethan Walker was used to. He stood at the entrance, staring at the dimly lit hallway beyond. He had never hesitated before walking into any boardroom, any high-stakes negotiation, but now, standing outside apartment 512, his heart pounded harder than it had in years. Beside him, Jonathan Walker shifted uneasily, his hands clenched into fists. The powerful businessman, always in control, now looked like a man on the edge of breaking. What if she hates me? Jonathan whispered, the rare vulnerability in his voice catching Ethan off guard. What if she wants nothing to do with me? Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We don't even know if she's really your daughter yet. Let's just talk to her. One step at a time. Jonathan nodded stiffly. Ethan lifted his hand and knocked. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, revealing Lena. Her brown eyes widened when she saw Ethan. You came back, she said, confused. Ethan gave her a small smile. I told you I'd take good care of the music box. Lena looked from Ethan to Jonathan, her young mind processing the presence of the older man. She tilted her head slightly. Who's he? Jonathan swallowed hard. His first time seeing his granddaughter, and she had no idea who he was. His voice failed him. He cleared his throat. I'm Jonathan. I'd like to speak with your mother. If that's okay. Lena hesitated. Her mother had always warned her about strangers. But something about Ethan and the way he spoke to her earlier made her believe he wasn't dangerous. Mom's resting, she finally said. She hasn't been feeling well. Ethan crouched down, meeting her gaze. It's important, he said gently. I promise we won't take too much of her time. Lena studied him for a moment, then nodded. Wait here. She closed the door behind her, leaving Ethan and Jonathan standing in tense silence. Jonathan let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can do this. You have to, Ethan said. You've already lost decades. Don't lose what time you have left. Before Jonathan could respond, the door creaked open again. Hannah stood in the doorway now, leaning against the frame, her face pale and tired. Ethan felt his chest tighten. She looked so much like the woman in the photograph, the same eyes, the same quiet strength. Hannah's gaze flickered between the two men. "Who are you?" she asked warily. Ethan hesitated, then simply said, "I think we're family." A long silence stretched between them. Hannah's fingers tightened on the doorknob. "You're Ethan Walker," she said finally, recognition dawning. "I've seen your face in magazines." Ethan nodded but said nothing. This wasn't about him. Hannah's gaze then shifted to Jonathan, and something flickered in her expression. A deep, unspoken emotion. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice softer now, but guarded. Jonathan stepped forward, his throat working, as if trying to find the right words. I knew your mother." His voice wavered. "A long time ago." Hannah inhaled sharply. "My mother." She studied his face, searching for something. Recognition, perhaps. Jonathan swallowed. "Catherine." Hannah's lips parted slightly, shock evident in her expression. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph from the music box, holding it out to her. Hannah hesitated before taking it. As her eyes landed on the image, her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she traced the faces in the picture, her mother's radiant smile, the young man beside her. "She never told me his name," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan's eyes were red-rimmed, glistening. "She never told me about you." Hannah pressed the photograph to her chest, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion. "She never stopped loving you." Jonathan let out a shaky exhale, as if the weight of all the years, all the lost time, had just come crashing down on him. Hannah looked at him then, really looked at him. The years had aged him, but there were still traces of the young man from the photograph. "You're my father," she said, more a realization than a question. Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. A mix of emotions crossed her face: anger, disbelief, grief, longing. Finally, she asked, "Why now?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Because I just found out. And because I don't want to waste another second." Silence fell between them again. Then, a small voice spoke. "Does that mean you're my grandpa?" Lena had slipped back into the room, her wide eyes darting between her mother and Jonathan. Jonathan turned to her, his face softening. He knelt down, looking at the little girl who was, impossibly, his granddaughter. "I think so," he said gently. If you'd like that." Lena studied him, then looked up at her mother for confirmation. Hannah hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. Then, with a deep breath, she looked at her daughter and said softly, "I think that's up to you." Lena turned back to Jonathan, her small face scrunched in thought. Then, without warning, she took a cautious step forward and hugged him. Jonathan let out a choked breath, his arms coming around her carefully, as if afraid she might disappear. Ethan watched his father, a man he had always seen as strong, unshakable, break down in tears as he held his granddaughter for the first time. Hannah wiped at her own tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have a lot to talk about." Jonathan nodded. "We do." And just like that, the decades of separation began to mend. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But it was a start. A second chance. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting pale shadows over the sterile white walls. The steady beeping of monitors filled the quiet room where Hannah Evans lay, her body frail, yet her spirit still burning with the will to fight. The reunion with her father, Jonathan Walker, and the newfound bond with her half-brother, Ethan, had been overwhelming, but there was no time to fully process it, not when the harsh reality of her illness loomed over them all. The news from the doctors had been devastating. "The cancer has spread more aggressively than we anticipated," Dr. Morris had told them, his voice grave. "Her liver is failing. Without a transplant, we're looking at weeks, maybe a month or two at best." Those words had sent a chilling silence through the room. Jonathan, a man who had spent his life controlling every outcome, now found himself powerless. Ethan, always the problem solver, the man with endless resources, now faced a battle where money meant little. But there was one solution. "A living donor is our best option," Dr. Morris continued. "Someone who's a match can donate a portion of their liver. The liver regenerates, meaning both the donor and recipient can live full lives after surgery." Without hesitation, Ethan had spoken. "Test me." Jonathan had immediately objected. "Ethan, this isn't a business risk, it's your life." Ethan had turned to his father, his expression unyielding. "She's my sister." He let the weight of those words settle in. Family means something, right? A series of tests followed, the days stretching unbearably long as they waited for results. Jonathan barely left Hannah's side, his guilt a constant shadow over him. He read to her, shared stories of her mother, of the years he had unknowingly lost. And then, the call came. "Ethan is a match," Dr. Morris confirmed. The relief was palpable, yet it carried its own burden. Now, in the dim hospital room, Ethan sat beside Hannah, the weight of the decision hanging between them. "You're not doing this," Hannah said weakly, though there was still steel in her voice. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, I am. It's too dangerous." He scoffed. "I've taken worse risks in business." "This isn't business, Ethan," she shot back. "This is your body, your life. You don't even know me well enough to make this kind of sacrifice." Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer now. "That's where you're wrong." He gestured to the room, to the little girl sleeping on the couch, Lena, who had no idea how close she was to losing her mother. "I've seen the way Lena looks at you. You're her whole world. And whether you believe it or not, you matter to me too." Hannah blinked rapidly, trying to push back the tears. "I don't want to be the reason something happens to you." Ethan reached out, taking her cold hand in his. "You won't be," he promised. "I've spent my whole life chasing things, success, power, respect. But none of it meant anything until I found you and Lena. I'm not losing either of you." Jonathan, who had been standing quietly by the window, turned toward them. His voice, rough with emotion, broke the silence. "Hannah, let him do this." Hannah looked at her father, seeing the rawness in his expression. Jonathan stepped closer, his hands trembling. "I've already lost so much time. Don't take away the chance for me to make things right." Tears slipped down Hannah's face. She squeezed Ethan's hand, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." The preparations moved quickly. Surgery was scheduled for the next morning. That night, Lena crawled onto her mother's hospital bed, curling against her side. "Are you scared, Mommy?" Hannah kissed the top of her head, stroking her soft curls. "A little," she admitted. "Uncle Ethan too?" Hannah glanced at Ethan, who smirked. "Me? Never." Lena studied him seriously, then reached out her pinky. "Promise you'll both come back?" Ethan hooked his pinky around hers. "Promise." The next morning, as Ethan was prepped for surgery, Jonathan sat beside him. "You know, I always wanted you to be tough, to be fearless," Jonathan said. but I never thought you'd prove it like this." Ethan gave him a tired grin. "Guess I take after my old man after all." Jonathan squeezed his shoulder, pride and fear mixing in his eyes. "Come back to me, son." Ethan simply nodded. As Hannah was wheeled into surgery, she locked eyes with Jonathan one last time. "Take care of Lena," she whispered. Jonathan bent down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You come back. You fight." She nodded, gripping his hand. The doors swung shut behind them, and the battle for life began. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the first thing Hannah heard as she drifted back to consciousness. The sterile scent of the hospital filled her nose, and when she opened her eyes, the ceiling lights above blurred before coming into focus. She was alive. A weak breath escaped her lips as she slowly turned her head. Sitting in a chair beside her bed, Lena was curled up, fast asleep, her tiny fingers still wrapped around her mother's hand. Hannah's heart clenched at the sight. "I made it. I'm here." Then, movement at the doorway caught her attention. Jonathan Walker, her father, stood there, looking as if he had aged years in just a few days. But when their eyes met, relief flooded his face. "You're awake," he whispered, stepping forward. Hannah tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Jonathan quickly poured a glass of water, helping her sip. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Hannah swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I got hit by a truck." A small, strained chuckle escaped him. "That sounds about right." She blinked, suddenly remembering. "Ethan." "He's fine," Jonathan assured her. "Sore, but fine." As if on cue, the door swung open wider, and Ethan Walker stepped inside, moving a little stiffly but flashing his signature smirk. "You didn't think I'd let you have all the attention, did you?" Hannah exhaled in relief. "You idiot," she murmured, her voice hoarse but full of gratitude. Ethan pulled up a chair beside the bed. "I've been called worse." He glanced down at Lena. "She wouldn't leave your side. We told her she could go home, but she refused." Hannah stroked Lena's hair, tears welling in her eyes. "She's braver than all of us." Jonathan sat down on the other side of the bed. "We all are, in our own way." He hesitated, then reached for Hannah's hand. "You fought, and you won." A lump formed in Hannah's throat. She had spent so many years fighting alone. But now, for the first time, she wasn't alone anymore. A few days later, when Hannah was strong enough to sit up and eat real food, Lena climbed onto the bed beside her, holding something in her small hands. "The music box," Hannah murmured as Lena placed it on her lap. "Uncle Ethan gave it back to me," Lena said proudly. "But he said it belongs to all of us now." Hannah looked at Ethan, who simply shrugged. It started this whole crazy journey. It only seemed right. Carefully, she opened the lid. The familiar melody drifted through the room, the tiny ballerina spinning gracefully. But this time, instead of sadness, Hannah felt something different, peace. Jonathan, Ethan, and Lena watched her, their family finally whole. And for the first time in years, Hannah truly believed in second chances. Spring had arrived in full bloom, painting the world with soft pastels and filling the air with the scent of fresh earth and budding flowers. In the backyard of their new home, sunlight filtered through the towering oak tree, casting dappled patterns over the neatly laid picnic blanket. Lena twirled barefoot in the grass, her laughter ringing out like music, her energy boundless now that her mother was healthy again. From the patio, Hannah watched her daughter with a peaceful smile. The last few months had been a whirlwind: surgeries, recovery, and an overwhelming adjustment to this new life. A life where she no longer had to struggle alone. A life where she had family. She turned to look at Jonathan Walker, who sat nearby, watching Lena with quiet adoration. The powerful businessman she had once feared meeting was now just a grandfather, softened by time and regret, making up for lost years the only way he knew how, by being present. "She's got your determination," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah chuckled softly. "And your stubbornness." Jonathan laughed, nodding. "Guilty as charged." Then, after a pause, he added, "I never imagined I'd get a second chance like this." Hannah met his gaze, seeing the weight of the past still lingering in his eyes. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But I'm glad we have it." Just then, Ethan Walker emerged from the house, carrying a small wooden box wrapped carefully in a silk cloth. He walked over to the picnic blanket, where Lena immediately ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Uncle Ethan, are you gonna play?" she asked, her face full of expectation. Ethan ruffled her hair. "Not just yet. First, I have something special." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing the music box. Lena gasped. "Mommy's music box." Ethan nodded, kneeling beside her. "But today, it's yours." Lena's eyes widened. "Really?" Hannah's breath caught. "Ethan." He looked at her, a small smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "This music box started everything, didn't it? It led me to Lena, to you. To all of us." He glanced at Jonathan. "It's only right that it stays in the family." Carefully, Lena took the box into her hands as if holding a treasure. She turned the tiny key, and the familiar melody drifted through the warm afternoon air. The ballerina twirled gracefully, just as it always had. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on his granddaughter's shoulder. "Take good care of it, sweetheart." "I promise," Lena whispered, holding it close to her chest. As the music played, a photo was taken, Jonathan, Hannah, Ethan, and Lena sitting together beneath the oak tree, their faces full of laughter and love. A new family. A new beginning. And this time, no one was alone.